I got an article we can discuss that's maybe a little more, abstract, I guess. I've got an article from, let's see, Spectrum Local News saying that a flood of business bankruptcies is likely in the coming months. We all kind of knew that as this pandemic started and people are changing and staying at home, that businesses were going to have trouble trying to adapt. There's some specific things in the article talking about how money took too long to get to the right people and that it was a stopgap at best because it's not a replacement for the revenue that they would get. And so there was also like an interesting point where it said that even a lot of the places that are hopeful that they will reopen feel that once they reopen, they can't return to normal operation because of social distancing. So they said like restaurants can't keep capacity even when things are working. The article looked at how many bankruptcies happened after 2008, and it said that there was 160K bankruptcies from filings from 2008 to 2010, and then tried to, talk about whether or not that was going to be a realistic, whether or not that would play out the same way. And the other thing is that there has been, since they know that there's going to be so many bankruptcies, they've added in some regulation such that attorney fees are streamlined in bankruptcy proceedings in the coming months, so that, well, I guess in the coming years, to try to make sure that, businesses who are already in a bad spot aren't getting raked over the coals. And then the other interesting point that it made that I thought was good to talk about is that it said one of the effects would be that the stigma of bankruptcy would go away, that people look at it as a bad thing now, and that not that you're viewed as a failure, but that the feeling that you get when you're filing is that you feel as a failure, but that because this is happening to everyone, that stigma goes away, which will then normalize bankruptcy. And so I guess I wanted to get your guys' take on whether or not you felt that the stigma of bankruptcy was previously effective, or whether or not you think that's really going to change in the next year or so.
I think you can kind of make, if you want to talk about stigma, I kind of think of in like the 1970s, if you had a DUI or knew somebody that had a DUI in the 1970s, man, they really had a drinking problem. But now, if you talk to people, because they've lowered the alcohol percentage that you can get a DUI with and really strongly enforce that kind of enforcement, you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find somebody that didn't at least know somebody that had a DUI. And so when you talk about a driving under the influence, the stigma is no longer there for like the social repercussions of having a DUI are no longer there, because everybody probably knows somebody that's had a DUI because the requirements to meet that threshold are so low. Now, I'm not saying we should do away with DUI laws. I think the blood alcohol, I don't think anybody should be driving intoxicated, period. But what I do think, I'm talking simply about the stigma of it. So I think there's a case study there to be made that if, a lot of businesses start going through this, and it would be interesting to look back at the historical data and how the stigma around companies, like say construction companies that went bankrupt and restarted, if that affected during the 2008, the Great Recession of 2008. I'm wondering if those, and I'm mentioning construction because housing was hit so bad, if there's a stigma or a lack thereof among the construction trade that could be kind of amalgamous to this. But I think the point remains that if there's a large swath of the United States, or, basically, it's who you know, if there's a large swath of people that you know, or there's somebody in your immediate group that has went through a bankruptcy and you feel it's of no fault of their own, then probably, or multiple people in that situation, then yeah, I would agree that probably the stigma behind a bankruptcy would lose its steam, and so I don't know, time will tell, but it's an interesting, I think, proposition where, that may not hold as much weight as it once did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a business standpoint, I think that there's been in my view, I was thinking about this the other day, that I feel like there's an unfortunate difference between going through personal bankruptcy versus running a business that goes through bankruptcy. Because I think that what I've seen, or my observation, is that if you're an entrepreneur and you have run a business or even multiple businesses that have gone through bankruptcy, it actually isn't that much of a stigma. If anything, usually in the process of doing that, you've made more connections, you've gained more experience, and often you become kind of in the industry that you're in. And a lot of these entrepreneurs and leaders have good opportunities after the company or the business itself goes bankrupt. And that's interesting when you compare that to if you were a solopreneur where the business was you personally and it was wrapped up with your personal finances. I think the system is more rigged against you when you personally then go through bankruptcy. I mean, it messes with your credit. I think there may be more social stigma. I guess the social stigma piece of it, I'm a little bit ambivalent to. I maybe because I don't have much of a social life outside of my family and the people that I work with. So for me, there's not much of a difference between business and social stigma. Like, I don't care if the neighbor down the street knows I had a bankruptcy. It doesn't make any difference to me, right? That's just not the world I live in where that would matter. But I suppose there's other people who's like, oh, Uncle Fred went through bankruptcy and that makes them the black sheep of the family somehow. Maybe that's an issue in some people's worlds. That's just not an issue for me. I don't like, if somebody in my family happened to have gone through bankruptcy, I wouldn't think much one way or the other if I even knew that. And I don't worry that they would think about me in that way, one way or the other. So for me, social stigma is not even an issue. It's really just, what's the business effect of this? Does this mean that I don't have access to capital because I've gone through bankruptcy? Does it mean that I couldn't get hired for the kind of job that I might want because I've been through bankruptcy? Those are the questions that come to my mind. But what I've said is that if you're operating at a high level, it seems like running a company into the ground, and which, let me be clear, I'm talking like pre-COVID, because there's a lot of businesses a lot of people who took a lot of big risks unrelated to coronavirus, that what I said, run their companies into the ground, may have gone through bankruptcy or ultimately near bankruptcy, had liquidity crises in their companies. And then they just go on and work for or lead other companies after that. That's very, very common, because the thing is that it's accepted and known in business that your leaders have to be able to they have to have the ability to take risks. And one thing about somebody who's run a company that goes through bankruptcy, you can say about them is they were willing to take the risk, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of my gut feeling about it, is that it doesn't necessarily sink you from a business perspective that you were operating a business that ultimately had a liquidity crisis or went through bankruptcy.
Yeah, totally. Because I think that, I mean, for one, we've had all these famous people who have famously had a bunch of bankruptcies. I think Walt Disney went bankrupt, I don't remember if it was 3 or 4 or 7 times or whatever it was, but you had that. And then I think also you view a business bankruptcy, or at least I view it oftentimes as a product of circumstance. A lot of times a business is wrapped up in an idea, and then that idea fails for a reason that isn't a failure of the owner or of the management of the business. It's just an issue of that product became irrelevant and that business wasn't set up to pivot or whatever. And so I agree that there's definitely a difference in personal bankruptcy versus corporate bankruptcy. And yeah, I just think that we're going to see a large amount of companies restructuring, and that it will become normalized to an extent, and that, yeah, like you said, there already wasn't that much of a corporate stigma, but there will be even less now because people view it as this special event. It was part of the challenge we all faced together. And so, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Unfortunate for everyone who's going through that, obviously, but good to know that it's not viewed in a negative light, because we're all facing, struggles right now.
Yeah, I mean, in business, the story matters, right? And I think to what you're saying, what Charlie's saying is COVID-19 gives you a ready written story. So it makes it kind of gives you the template to move on.
Well, I think maybe we should rebrand bankruptcy and just call it what it is: debt extinguishment. Yeah, I went through a phase of debt extinguishment, and maybe because we're accountants, we look at it differently, where there isn't a stigma for us around somebody that went through bankruptcy because all they did was execute a debt extinguishment that they couldn't pay for. So I think, having a clear idea of what it is, and maybe we can help with the stigma out there, I think we should take a stand on this podcast and kind of rebrand bankruptcy as debt extinguishment. I think
Definitely. COVID Section 11, we can call it. And
COVID debt extinguishment,
Yeah.
reliquidization.